Now, some of the homes that still exist that clearly were beautiful at one time and now are in need of some love and repair. One good example of that is at 1800 3rd Street, Northwest.
Oh, this home was, in that picture, it wasn't in disrepair. Today it is. In fact, I had to recall, which home is she talking about? Because you can't even recognize it. Well, anyway, it belonged to a lady that we call Miss Gertrude, and she had a little card shop in the 1300 block of U Street. But she also had roomers. She had students from Howard who roomed with her. And at her death, she left the house to one of the students who had roomed with her, a Mr. Hunter. And I think that through the years, he died or whatever, and the home has just been fallen to disrepair. And I know several people. I know Lou Chapman once tried to find out how to buy the house. I don't know about the deeding or who really had the title or whatever. And now it's for sale with one of the premier sales company. I think it's Sotheby or somebody up there. I see a sign. So it'll be bought as is, I'm sure. And there's a possibility somebody will get it and bring it back to its former grandeur. As you can see by the photograph, it was a very nice, one of the stately homes. And I think at that time, when it was built, it was the home of Mr. Gannett. He was something, a geographer or something. He worked for the city government. And he was a contemporary of the Bernies and General Olive Otis Howard. And as you can see, when they built it, they brought in their confreres and their friends were buying into LeDroit Park because it became a nice place to live.
Now let's move to the 500 block of T Street. I believe we have examples of 510 and 512, the homes there.
At 510 and 512, on my left was the home of Mr. Newman, and on my right was the home of Mr. Louis Vaughn, who was the architectural mechanical drawing teacher at Armstrong. And Captain Newman was once principal of Armstrong, but he also was leader of having the cadet corps. And in that home, his wife was Miss Jenny Newman, and she was the sister to Dr. James Walker. She was the sister to the wife of Major James Walker, the first soldier to be killed in World War I. And the two sisters lived, now she lived in the house that isn't shown in the picture, the Walker home. But Miss Newman also lived with her niece. After Captain Newman died, her niece came to live with her, Beatrice Walker, who was the sister of Dr. James Walker, who lived in the house that his mother and father had, which was 502 T Street. And on my left, I don't remember who lived there, but I know on my right, Dr. Walker lived in that house. And he later bought the house adjoining his house and built a little addition on it, and they rented it out. And his first wife, he had a second wife was Miss Booker, and she was a teacher in the schools. And at her death, he married another lady, and they moved away from LeDroit Park. But that house, if you can look at it, you can see that it's in that style of McGill, where you have the window coming out. They're not flat. You have a projection of your window, almost like a semi-double bay. And then you have your side entrance. And he had room for a driveway, taking the yard. All of the places had enough yardage to have a driveway put in if you wanted one, when cars became popular. And he was the son of Major James E. Walker. And he was a physician trained at Howard. And his mother, I don't know, possibly in those days she had been educated, but she didn't teach because a woman didn't work. and once you're married, you didn't teach in the school system. That broke down later. I remember my mother-in-law telling me that when she married, she could not have been a teacher. But after the birth of her son, she got a job when he was 2 years old. A married woman could go to work. But when she became pregnant with my husband, she had to go home and stay, and I think you had a 2-year leave before you go back to work. I don't know what was the premise for that, I don't know. But I'm sure some women's rights activists had to tell them. And today, you can work right until the last minute and come back the next day if you want to.
Now let's go to the current site of United Planning Organization headquarters, which was where former mansion was on that site, as well as a few other places like the Elks and the
yes.
Safeway.
In the picture here, you see the McClellan Mansion. He lived here before James McGill. That was like a farm area. He lived here before they had the subdivision laid out, and that was his mansion, and he had trees all around. And after his death, the Elks bought that home, and it became the Elks home. Later on, the Elks were losing money, and they didn't have much money, so they, the Lady Elks said they could have saved the Elks home, but the men were too proud to accept their funds. So they sold it to the Safeway, and they built on that lot the Safeway. Well, we had a Safeway for quite a while, I think in the 60s, late 60s or something, and maybe by 70s when the Safeway was decided to close and move over on 4th Street Northeast and build a larger store. And that was ruination for me, because I didn't know how to buy by 2 weeks or a month. I went to the store every day, and it was a community meeting there. My friends were there, we talked and chatted, and then go home, rush home to go get the kids from school. So after the Safeway bought it from the Elks, they built a smaller home on 3rd Street, just like a little annex for them, for what they were used to. And that's the history of the Elks home being in LeDroit Park. And that beautiful home going to be now the United Planning Organization, which is a big structure there. And they had plenty of all that yard they have for the park, and all of that was part to that wall. And that wall butted the sidewalk for what was then Boundary Street before we were annexed into the city in 1901. We became Washington, D.C., and we were not Washington County anymore. And our street names changed to be in congruence with the city streets named for avenues and numbered streets.
Now let's move to a home on 3rd Street. It was a home of Kelly Miller, who you talked a little bit about earlier. Want to talk a little bit more about Kelly Miller? And
that was the home of Kelly Miller's son, Paul Miller. Dr. Kelly Miller lived on College Street, where Howard has some of his dormitories now, as well as Dr. Drew had a house on College Street. But this is one of the McGill homes, and it has since been renovated, and a teacher by the name of Evelyn Tolan, a retired teacher, lives in the home now. That's in the 1900 block of 3rd Street. And it was, Paul Miller was a printer. He had a printing shop. And his sister was Maid Miller Sullivan, a poetess. And Dr. Kelly Miller was a math teacher, a professor here, and one of his aspirations was to have been president of Howard University. But he never won the nomination. And but I don't think he was bitter. He continued his work and his teaching. And that's why the project that was built was named in his honor, the Kelly Miller Dwellings. So his name lives on.
And you'd also mentioned earlier Paul Lawrence Dunbar, and lived in 2 homes on 4th and on T Street, I believe.
4th Street and the 300 block, 321 U Street.
On U Street.
When he was at 1934 4th Street, was in 1900 block, it was 3 houses there. He was working at the Library of Congress. He made $728 a year. He was like some kind of poet in residence there or something. But in the rooming house, he also met up with Will Marion Cook. And Will Marion Cook had this music in his, he was writing an operetta. And I think it was the Clorinda and the Cakewalk was one of the operettas that he wrote. But in this one in particular that he was writing, he was on the piano playing this new jazz that he had in his head, Paul Laurence Dunbar, writing the lyrics in dialect. And the song was, "Who dat to say chicken when I say chicken?" His mother came in from the kitchen in tears. my son, we sent you to school for classical work. What is this stuff you're playing on the piano?" But he didn't despair. He continued. He went on to Broadway. He had Abyssinia. He had many operettas. He went through a lot of hard times as a musician, as a creative artist. And his wife was Abby Lincoln. And they had one son, Dr. Mercer Cook, who was a professor at Howard University. But in the meantime, Paul Laurence Dunbar met up with Alice Moore, who was a poetess in her own right, and they married, and then they came to live at 321 U Street. But their marriage did not last very long, so about 1906, he was too sick to stay here, and he moved back to Dayton, Ohio, where in a few years he died from TB.
Now, I hadn't thought about that before, really, as LeDroit Park I mean, obviously thinking about it as a cultural capital, as a social capital, but actually thinking about Paul Laurence Dunbar and Will Marion Cook actually collaborating together as artists. I hadn't thought about that before. Now Cook lived on 4th Street, is that correct? Right.
But then his parents were teachers at Howard University, and there was one of his relatives, Professor George Cook, that later, I think, lived in the house that had been the McGill House at on Bryan Street. And one of their descendants also was the husband of Ruth Cook, who lived in the house on T Street that Dr. Richardson lives in. Her father was Nelson Weatherless. That was the Weatherless home. He was a scientist, a photographer. He fought against discrimination at the Chase Theater. He wanted our people to be able to go and enjoy the theater. And he left the home to Howard University. His daughter lived in it until her death. And that was something else that was a characteristic of the early residents. They willed their property to Howard because they were so proud of having been a part of the university. And I always thought that Miss Payton's house was going to be willed to Howard University, but I think she left it to her sister. I'm not sure. And that home that you see now at the corner, Miss Cook had it renovated, imitating Mrs. Wilkinson. They sandblasted their yellow paint off and had the bricks restored and left unpainted. And she left most of the characteristics of the house, the slate roof, the decorations around, the beautiful floral shrubbery. She had a sun parlor added on, which she liked, and she lived there after her husband, Mr. Cook, died. She lived there alone, and she died at Freedman's Hospital, but my neighbor, Mr. Burke, used to take her to the bank and to the store, and she had this classical voice. "Oh, Mr. Burke, can I use you today? I need to go to the bank." "Yes, Miss Cook." He carried Miss Cook and Dr. Wilkinson's widow, Carrie Wilkinson. He had to take him to the bank or to the store, and he was my next door neighbor. He lived to be 93. He died on his feet. He was working and keeping up with everything. At his church, he was delivering lunches to the sick and shut in. So when he was stricken, the pastor went to Howard, I think it was Washington Hospital Center, to see, he was looking for a Mr. Burke, a Mr. James Burke. And they said, Mr. James Burke, well, he's in room, oh, you mean the elderly man that's in room 102? He said, no, 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 I'm not talking about an old man. I'm talking about a man that, a young, youthful, vibrant man. They said, the only James Burke we have here is in 102. He said he did not know that here was this 93-year-old man delivering lunches and doing church errands, and as vibrant as he was. But anyway, that was one of the characteristics of people living in LeDroit Park. He fixed everything on his house. He'd get up on the ladder, paint the roof. He didn't like it to paint our houses at the same time. He did his own painting and own maintenance around the house. And today, that house is drawn into mine, and the people that own it are not doing anything with it right now. So.
Well, let's move on to the intersection at 3rd and Elm, and I understand that the Linden and Harewood apartments used to be there before they were torn down.
Well, as you know, the streets in the LeDroit Park subdivision were floral streets. They were named for trees, and these apartment buildings were named for two of the streets, the Linden and the Harewood. But they are no longer there. They were torn down because they were already inhabited when, in 1973, when we were working on getting a designation for historic status. And we had Linden Street, which is 4th Street. We had Larch, which is 5th Street. 6th Street was Juniper. And the two main avenues, Spruce Street, which is where I live, and Maple Street, which is where Mayor Washington's house was located. And then we had the Circle, the Anna J. Cooper Circle. I don't know what they called it then, but that was supposed to have been like a focal point in the layout of the planning of the subdivision. And from there you can see the Gage School, and also all the new things that are happening in LeDroit Park.
Now, the next home that we're going to take a look at is the home of Garnett Wilkinson. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Well, Dr. Wilkinson lives in one of the Italian villa homes in the 400 block of U Street, and his widow, he was widowed and he remarried. And Miss Caroline Mann came to the house. He had not changed anything in the house, I guess, from the day he and his first wife moved in it. She had it painted and renovated, and this brick sandblasted and left its natural color and painted around. But she left the top and made a nice porch. So when he died, she lived in the house alone until her death. Also, at this home, when Dr. Wilkinson came to live there, he was superintendent of the black schools. We had two divisions. We had Division I and Division II. Division I, from 1 to 9, encompassed the white students. Divisions 10 through 13 were for black. And he also had attended Howard Law School. But Dr. Wilkinson was a graduate of Oberlin College, and he came here. He taught at the M Street High School, and he was a very handsome man. His brother, Dr. Fred Wilkinson, was a secretary at Howard University. He and his wife had no children, and the second marriage was a later marriage, and they had no children. But he also was an icon in his own right. He loved to come to the graduation at Howard, and he was accorded a status at the graduation day, and that was a fashion parade. I would sit in my bay window and watch the elite going up to the graduation or program at Howard, and then they used to have concerts. I remember Roland Hayes came, sang at Crampton Auditorium, and musicians would come. They'd have classical concerts, and the neighbors would go to that. And in the summer, the art department would put on Shakespearean plays, which were held in the open outside by Douglas Hall. And the director of the plays, I know we could go and watch some of the rehearsals. Now, at her death, she left the house to her niece, who was a resident then of California. And it's now owned by Brian Logan, who is now residing back in the home after renting it for several years to students. And he once had a health care home there, but now he's in the residence himself.
This home is in your block,
yes,
correct?
in my
Where
block.
You live.
Yes, I said it's that Italian villa block. And as you can see, each house almost had a uniqueness about the style. It's almost like a little Dutch part the way his roof is made, and the house adjoining it is very plain. And then, like my house and the house next, the Burke house, they are more plain. But his house has, and with the bay window, and the way it's curved around, and the roof, the beautiful roof, it makes it have a unique style and of its own. And I think that's the characteristic of James McGill. He incorporated other styles and had his own touch to make the homes beautiful. And I think this was a trial adventure for them when they later went on to other adventures in real estate and building and annexing the city and improving or whatever. So it's been one of the characteristics of LeDroit Park, that the homes were mostly stayed. They were staying intact. And those few homes that had the brick sandblasted, such as the house, the Nelson Weatherly's house on T Street, and the house here at 406 U Street. Not all the homes were sandblasted, but they retained the colors, beige, the dark green or the dark brown, gray, and cream colors in the exterior of the bricks.
Now, there was an important politician, I understand, Oscar DePriest, who also lived on your block?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. We can't leave out Oscar DePriest, the first black congressman in the 20th century. The other congressmen and senators had been in the Reconstruction area of our country. But Oscar DePriest lived at 419 U Street, and he came from Chicago, and he was served several terms as congressman, and he lived there, and he also started a club with Dr. Wilkinson and other men called the DePriest 13, and they were the prominent men, and they met and had social activities and talked about concerns of the day. And I think one of the members was the banker who started the Industrial Bank. And I know Dr. Wilkinson was one of the members, prominent members of his of the DePriest 13, and now the house is occupied by a Dr. Warrell, who's a pathologist at Howard University, and so it has stayed the same. After DePriest left, it was bought by Dr. Suzanne Brown, and she lived in it until her death. And I thought for a while that Howard was going to buy the house, but she had a niece that laid claim to the house, so Howard couldn't get it. She bought the house, and she lived in it until she went to Africa to be a doctor, and sold it to Dr. Worrell.
Wonderful photograph of the well-dressed women, the ladies' club of LeDroit Park, and was also important to dressing was the best dressing on Sunday, looking your Sunday best. And
indeed it was. And you wore your fancy hat. You may have worn that hat every Sunday, but it didn't matter. It was proper. And here in this photo that was given to me by Mr. Cooney also are two well-dressed men and the lady in front. And I'm assuming it might have been the mother and her two sons attired to attend the church service on Sunday, properly dressed, representing LeDroit Park at its best. And as you could see from the previous picture, the ladies attired for the tea and the party. You were also associated with Howard University for the cultural events here, the plays, the recitals, and also getting extra training. Many people just attended night classes, even in the pharmacy school or the medical school, but never became a doctor or a pharmacist. It was just an advantage that they had when your tuition was very nominal. It wasn't like today. I mean, may have been $7 or $8, but still, that was a lot of money to pay for courses at the college or for self-enhancement. And this is just a typical feature of Sunday morning. And I can remember my street when Mr. Carter, his wife and daughter went to church. He walked first, Mrs. Carter walked behind him, and the daughter kind of lagged a little bit behind her father. They walked to Lincoln Temple, which was at 11th and U. They walked there and they walked back. And even after he was getting older and not well, Mama pushed him along so that he could get to church. And they came back, and that was the way it was in LeDroit Park in the grand old days.
So you're referring to the Carters in your block, the two Marion Carters?
Right.
Okay.
Marion Elizabeth and Marion Jackson Carter. Mrs. Carter herself claimed they were descendants from Thomas Jefferson. She has a couple of chairs in her home that are roped off because it came from, I don't know, Monticello or somewhere. Her family was prominent in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Jacksons. Her mother, Mrs. Nanny Cox Jackson, was a teacher there, and they have dedicated an athletic field and named it in her honor. Now, on this street, the Carters lived at 402, but on 400, her mother bought that house, and she rented it and got the rent for her mama. After Mama died, she owned both houses. And one thing about Mrs. Carter, she was a realtor, but without realizing it. She had those two houses, the house Dr. Hattie Riggs gave her, and then we had two houses on our street where an elderly lady lived and a man. They were a unique couple, Mr. Bannister and Mrs. Mundy. Mr. Bannister died, and he had a niece to come here to inherit the house, but she got sick and went back home, and Miss Carter acquired that house. Adjoining that house was Miss Mundy's house. She expired in the home, and Miss Carter, came right there when the ambulance came, and the nieces and whatnot, they were two relatives, her side and his side. So they didn't want the house because they lived in Richmond and Pittsburgh, so there Miss Carter acquired that house. And then adjoining that house is the home that Bobby Lewis, Mr. Bobby Lewis, and his wife Emma Lewis. And his uncle was Mr. Algernon Jackson, who was an alderman in Chicago. His sister, Miss Mamie Lewis, was so beautiful. She was on the cover of, sheet music. You had pretty models. Well, she was a model for the sheet music, and she married Dr. Williams, who had the pharmacy on Florida Avenue, and she was a teacher. And the younger sister was the most glamorous of all, Miss Pearlie. She lived in Baltimore, and her husband, Mr. Pennington, I think was a principal or either a coach or something at Morgan University. But anyway, at the end, Emma Lewis, the widow, and her sister, Miss Eva Lucas, lived there, and both died. And Miss Carter acquired that house. So it made Miss Carter the realtor of LeDroit Park, owning 7 homes. And to this day, Elizabeth is alive, but she's in a nursing home in Maryland. And her nephew, Eddie Carter, is overseer of properties belonging to Miss Carter, Mrs. Carter. And at Mrs. Carter's death, her younger sister said, "Marion, you're not going to be able to handle that property." And she told me at the wake, she said, "Marion doesn't have the business sense to handle that property. What are they going to do with that property?" Elizabeth showed them that she was in charge of Mama's property, and she would do just as Mama would do. Oh, by the way, Mrs. Carter's younger sister, Gladys Jackson Duncan, was the widow of Todd Duncan, the musician, the great musician. And she lived to be about 100, I think, dying a couple of years ago. And so they have longevity. I told Eddie the other day, I said, "My aunt has longevity and your aunt has longevity, so we just have to wait." And that's the way it goes. So they were, and she also graduated from Wellesley, Elizabeth, Marion Elizabeth, in 1945, and she went on to get a PhD from Catholic University. She told the tale that when they were interviewed, her mother always escorted her because her mother overprotected her, and the interviewing officer said, "And just why would a young colored girl like you want to go to Catholic University?" And Mama spoke up and said, "Just like any little white girl would want to go. She wants a PhD, and she excelled at Wellesley. She graduated with honors, and that's what she wants to do. She wants to go to Catholic University." And she went to Catholic University and got that degree. She went to Middleburg, somewhere up in Vermont. She acquired degrees. She studied in Paris. She studied, she liked Spanish. She was in Spanish. She was an interpreter. She wrote her own textbook, which I have a copy of in my home. And, but sad to say, with all of that knowledge, there comes a time when the mechanics of our brains fold in. And now she's in retirement at a nursing home in Baltimore.